That was the question circling my mind like a hawk above a wounded animal. The sun had just dipped behind the hills of Asheville, North Carolina, casting a burnt orange hue over the city skyline. My name is Alyssa Monroe, and on this particular evening, I stood barefoot on the damp grass behind the house I grew up in. The house my parents no longer wanted me in. The house where my childhood echoed off the walls, now silent, abandoned by their love, and filled only with the ghost of who I used to be. A single duffel bag rested by my side, stuffed with all the belongings I was allowed to take. The rest? Left behind like I never mattered. As if my existence could be deleted with one final argument and a slammed door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood in that dusky light with my heart hammering like a war drum, trying to make sense of how love could turn so cold, so suddenly. But if you ask me now, I'd tell you something different. I'd tell you they wanted me gone. But destiny had been waiting for this moment all along. It didn't begin that day, though. No, betrayal never walks through the front door unannounced. It creeps in silently, hiding behind fake smiles and polite phrases. I should have seen it coming. The way my mother had started looking at me differently, like I was more burden than blessing. The way my father became quieter around me, more distant. The way my sister, Lacey, had started whispering in hushed tones behind closed doors and locking her phone the second I entered the room. And then there was the job I had lost just weeks before. My first big opportunity after graduating, snatched from me without warning or reason. Only later would I find out who really pulled those strings. But that night, as I watched my breath cloud in the autumn air, none of it made sense. Only one thought screamed louder than the rest. You've been erased. Have you ever stood in the middle of your own life and realized you don't belong anywhere? It's a hollow feeling, like screaming into a canyon and hearing nothing come back. Like every piece of you that once made sense has been scattered, and you're just there, waiting. Wondering if maybe the problem is you. That's where I was. At 24, I wasn't supposed to be starting from zero. I wasn't supposed to be alone. I wasn't supposed to be unwanted. But what they didn't know, what even I didn't know, was that sometimes the best parts of your story begin when everything familiar falls apart. Because that's where destiny finds you. Not when you're comfortable, but when you're cracked wide open. The wind picked up. Leaves danced around my bare feet as I took one last look at the house. Every window dark. Every door closed. No one came out to stop me. No one ran after me. No voices cried out, "Wait." I pulled my hoodie tighter and picked up the duffel. One step. 2 steps. And just like that, I walked away. But not in defeat. Though I didn't know it yet, that walk would become the most important journey of my life. Because someone was watching. They say that when you hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up. But what they don't tell you is how dark that bottom can feel. I didn't have a plan. No job. No apartment. My phone battery was nearly dead, and my bank account barely had enough for 2 nights in a cheap motel. No one to call. No one who would answer even if I did. But I had something else. A tiny, flickering flame somewhere deep inside me. A whisper, soft but persistent. This isn't where your story ends. I ended up walking 2 miles in the cold before I found a bus that would take me downtown. I sat near the window, clutching my bag like it held pieces of my soul. A man in a brown coat stared at me for too long. A mother rocked her baby across the aisle. And I just kept looking out the window, watching the blur of city lights. It was strange. How the world kept moving even when mine felt like it had stopped. By the time I checked into the motel, the sky was pitch black. The room was small, smelled faintly of bleach, and had a single flickering light bulb that made everything feel even more temporary. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. And then the tears came. Not loud sobs. Not the kind you see in movies. But quiet, hot streams that slipped down my cheeks one after the other. I let them fall. I let them burn. It wasn't just sadness. It was grief. The kind that comes when everything you believed about your life turns out to be a lie. But here's the thing about grief. It clears space. And in that space, something new can grow. That night, Lying in that strange bed under scratchy motel sheets, I stared at the ceiling and whispered, "If anyone's listening, help me." I didn't know if it was God, or the universe, or some ancient energy in the stars. But someone was listening. Because that night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. And in my dreams, I saw something strange, something I couldn't explain. A field of light, a staircase made of stars, and a voice, not loud, but gentle, like the breeze on a summer evening. "You're not broken, Alyssa. You're becoming." I woke up the next morning with tears on my pillow and a strange kind of peace in my chest. The pain was still there, yes, but it was wrapped in something new. Hope. Not the kind you find in movies. The quiet kind. The kind that says, keep going. That day, I made a choice. I could either believe what they said about me, that I was a failure, a disappointment, unworthy, or I could believe that maybe, just maybe, I was meant for something more. And so began the first steps into the unknown. No safety net. No one cheering me on. Just me. And destiny. The story really begins years before that motel room. Back when I still believed that love was unconditional, that family meant forever, and that hard work always paid off. Back when I was still her, the version of Alyssa Monroe who didn't yet know what people were capable of when their jealousy outweighed their loyalty. I was born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina, in a modest blue house tucked between maple trees and winding roads. I was the middle child, wedged between my older sister Lacey and my younger brother Trevor. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Dad was a construction supervisor who left at sunrise and came home smelling like dust and sweat. Mom worked part-time at the public library and baked cookies on Sundays. Our lives weren't glamorous, but they felt safe, secure, loved. At least, they did to me. But if I look back now with honest eyes, I realize the cracks were always there. They just disguised them well. Lacey was always the golden child. Blonde, outgoing, and effortlessly charming. She got straight A's without trying, had a full scholarship to Duke, and could convince my parents of anything with just a few sweet words and a well-timed smile. I loved her, truly, but I was always aware of how brightly she shined, and how dim I felt standing next to her. I was quieter. A thinker. The girl who stayed in on Saturday nights to write poetry or sketch people from the cafe window downtown. I didn't light up rooms, I listened, observed, and took everything in. My dad used to joke that I lived in my head too much. My mom would just nod and say, "She'll grow out of it." I never did. And that became the problem. Because as we got older, the differences between us stopped being innocent and started being dangerous. Lacey became competitive, controlling. She would correct me in front of our parents, undermine my ideas, and subtly plant doubts in their minds. I don't think I noticed it at first, how she turned them against me one small comment at a time. But by the time I was in college, I could feel it. They smiled when I visited, but there was always a chill in the air. A wall I couldn't name. Conversations grew shorter. Praise became rare. And when I struggled, even slightly, it was as if they were waiting for me to fail. Still, I didn't give up. I worked hard. I majored in marketing and communications. I took on part-time jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't. I interned over the summers, built a portfolio, and landed a spot at one of the top marketing firms in Raleigh right after graduation. That job meant everything to me. It was my chance to finally make my own name. To prove, if not to them, then to myself, that I was worth something. That I could thrive, even if I wasn't their golden girl. For 6 months, things were good. I was focused, confident, even making new friends at work. My manager, Jessica, took me under her wing, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged. Until I made a mistake. A minor error on a client campaign. A simple oversight in data placement. I caught it, corrected it, and submitted the final draft well before the deadline. Jessica even complimented me for how I handled it. But a week later, I was called into HR. A formal complaint had been made against me, something about falsifying data and breaching ethical guidelines. I was stunned. Shocked. I explained everything. Showed my timestamps. provided all the evidence. But the decision had already been made. They told me they had to take it seriously. They asked me to pack up my desk that same afternoon. I didn't know it then, but that complaint? It was anonymous. And it traced back to an IP address from my family's house. From Lacey's room. When I confronted her later, she laughed. I remember the moment so clearly. I had driven back to Asheville, tears still drying on my cheeks, adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I burst into the house, demanded answers, and she just laughed. "You always take things so personally, Alyssa," she said, twirling a strand of her perfectly curled hair. "Maybe you weren't as good at your job as you thought." My parents stood behind her, silent, watching, their arms folded. No one defended me. No one believed me. That was the day everything changed. I packed my things that night and moved into a friend's guest room for a few days. Tried applying for jobs, but the stain on my record made companies hesitant. I sent dozens of applications, each rejection chipping away at me like rust on a fragile gate. Eventually, I had to leave the guest room. I had no income, nowhere else to go. So I returned home. One last time. That's when my parents gave me an ultimatum. You can stay for 2 weeks. After that, you're on your own. And they meant it. 14 days later, my dad stood at my bedroom door. No emotion, no softness, just a reminder that my time was up. My mother wouldn't even meet my eyes. And Lacey? She stood in the hallway smiling, arms folded like she had just won a game only she was playing. That's how I ended up under that burnt orange sky with a duffel bag at my feet. That's how I became a girl with no home, no job, and no one in her corner. But I also became something else. I became a woman who had nothing left to lose. And that, as destiny would soon show me, was the most powerful thing I could ever become. There's something funny about starting over. You think it's the end. You think it means defeat. But in truth, it's a rebirth. In the weeks after I left, I spent every ounce of energy I had just surviving. I did odd jobs, dog walking, cleaning houses, freelance copywriting whenever I could find it. I stayed in motels, couch surfed with acquaintances, sometimes even slept in my car. But in those quiet moments in the loneliness, something was shifting. I began journaling again, writing down my thoughts, prayers, memories. I wrote about everything, about Lacey, my parents, the job, the betrayal. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a victim. I started seeing a pattern. How every time someone tried to silence me, I came back stronger. How every door that shut only pushed me to find another way. How every lie made me dig deeper into the truth of who I really was. It was in that clarity that I started dreaming again. Not small dreams. Big ones. The kind that make people uncomfortable. The kind that demand space. And I promised myself I would not just survive. I would rise. The first moment I realized destiny was on my side came in the most unexpected place, a coffee shop in downtown Asheville. I had just finished an overnight cleaning shift at a small office building and stumbled in half asleep, craving caffeine and 5 minutes of warmth. I took a seat by the window, pulled out my journal, and began writing. I wrote not because I had a goal. I wrote because I had to. Because the pain, the silence, the betrayal, it all lived in my bones, and writing was the only way to keep from collapsing under it. That's when he noticed me. An older gentleman with soft eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard, sitting across the room, sipping black coffee and observing me quietly. I was used to stares, mostly judgment or pity. But this was different. After a while, he stood up, walked over to my table, and said, "You write like someone who's survived fire." I blinked, unsure whether to be alarmed or flattered. He introduced himself as Mr. Carlton James, a retired literature professor turned independent publisher. He had seen me writing for the past 3 mornings, always in the same booth, always alone. I didn't say much, but he kept talking. And then he asked, "Would you ever consider letting someone read your story?" I shrugged. "It's just a journal." He smiled. Some of the most powerful books started out as journals. That conversation led to coffee. Coffee led to me showing him one of my entries, raw, unedited, bleeding emotion on every page. And that led to the first time anyone said, "You have a voice people need to hear." I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of my redemption arc. Still, the journey from that conversation to actually building something was anything but smooth, because as my spirit started to lift, they noticed. It began subtly. I started publishing anonymous essays online, using a pen name and sharing snippets of my life, my trauma, my awakening. I wrote about betrayal, about surviving abandonment, about starting from scratch. My words were honest, unpolished, and vulnerable. To my surprise, they spread. People related. They commented, shared. Some even messaged me, thanking me for writing what they hadn't been able to say themselves. It was healing, until one post went viral. And with it, my identity was exposed. The post was titled, "The Day My Family Chose to Forget Me." It detailed everything: the job sabotage, Lacey's manipulation, my parents' silence. I didn't name names, but it wasn't hard for people in town to put the pieces together. And that's when the backlash began. From them. Lacey called first, not to apologize, but to threaten. "You need to take that post down, Alyssa. Now. Do you have any idea what you've done to our reputation?" I stayed silent. "You think this makes you some kind of hero? You're just bitter. Delusional." I hung up without replying. But it didn't stop there. My parents sent an email, cold, legal sounding. If I didn't retract the post, they'd pursue defamation charges. They accused me of lying, of attacking family for attention, of humiliating them. It crushed me, not because I feared their threats, but because even now, even with everything laid bare, they still chose to protect themselves instead of facing the truth. I started questioning everything again. Was I wrong to speak out? Was I being cruel? Was I the villain in their story? But then I reread the comments on that post. Dozens of people had written, "This is my story too. Thank you for putting words to what I felt for years. Please don't stop writing." That's when I realized this wasn't just my story. It was our story, a universal ache shared by so many silenced voices. But the deeper I leaned into truth, the more the conflict escalated. A week later, I was doxxed. My phone number leaked. Anonymous messages flooded in, some accusing me of tearing a family apart, others threatening legal action. One message simply read, "You should have disappeared when you had the chance." For the first time, I was afraid, not of them, but of being visible, being powerful. Because when you finally find your voice, the people who once controlled you will do anything to silence it again. That night, I drove to the same spot behind my childhood home. I parked the car and walked out onto that same patch of grass where I once stood with nothing but a duffel. This time, I stood taller. This time, I wasn't broken. I whispered into the wind, "You wanted me gone, but I'm still here." The very next day, I received an offer from a small indie publisher who had seen my viral post. They wanted to compile my essays into a book. A real book. Mr. Carlton helped negotiate the deal. I cried when I signed the contract. Not because I'd made it, but because for the first time in years, someone believed in me. But destiny wasn't finished yet. Because the moment I began to rise, they tried one final time to drag me back down. Lacey filed a restraining order against me, claimed I was stalking her, that I was unstable. She presented fake screenshots, edited messages, even convinced one of her friends to lie on her behalf. The story hit local gossip pages. People whispered in cafes. My past was being twisted again. But this time I had proof. And I had people. People who had read my story, believed me, who knew the truth. The court dismissed her case within a week. And suddenly, she wasn't the golden girl anymore. That was the turning point. The lies cracked. The mask fell. And the people who once painted me as broken were now exposed. But none of that brought me joy. Because when you grow, you stop craving revenge. You start seeking peace. I didn't retaliate. I didn't gloat. I wrote. I poured every emotion, every memory, every scar into that manuscript. And when the book finally published, titled "They Wanted Me Gone," It sold more copies than anyone expected. Not because I was famous, not because I had connections, but because truth resonates. People from all over wrote letters, shared their stories, and through that, I found my purpose. I started speaking at events, hosting workshops, helping others find their voice. My pain had become a platform. My silence had become strength. And yet, some nights, I still felt it. The sting. The wound that never fully heals. Because even when you forgive, you don't forget. There's a moment when you realize the storm you feared is over. But instead of peace, you feel something else. Emptiness. It was a rainy evening when I stood backstage at the Asheville Civic Center. Rows of chairs filled with strangers, waiting. Not to judge me, not to break me, but to hear my story. My name, Alyssa Moore, flashed across the digital screen behind the podium. Below it, author, speaker, survivor. The very identity they tried to strip from me was now my truth. But as the lights dimmed and the host introduced me, I felt my heart pounding like it did the day I left home with nothing. Because tonight wasn't just another talk. Tonight they were here. My parents. Sitting in the fifth row. Let me rewind. A week before the event, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, handwritten. I opened it cautiously, my fingers trembling. The letter was simple, no apologies or explanations. Just a line that read, "We will be at your event. We need to understand what we never did." It wasn't an olive branch. It wasn't an act of courage. It was a consequence. They had read the book. Or, at least enough of it. The town had changed its tune. Neighbors no longer nodded at them in the grocery store. Even Lacey had left town, quietly, after being exposed in a local article that mirrored the truths in my memoir. And so, they came, to witness what they couldn't deny anymore. As I stepped onto the stage, the lights hit my face. The microphone hummed softly in my hands. And for a brief moment, I stood in silence. Not frozen. Centered. I looked out at the crowd and began. What does it mean to be discarded by the people who should have fought for you? I let the question hang in the air. You don't forget the way your stomach drops when someone you love pretends you never existed. You don't forget the way silence screams louder than words. Eyes locked with mine, some nodding, some wiping tears. I continued. I used to think I was unwanted, like a piece of clutter that didn't match the room. But I learned something in the years that followed. Pause. That when someone wants you gone, it doesn't mean you're worthless. It means your light exposes their shadows. The room was silent except for soft sniffles. Then I did something no one expected. I turned toward the fifth row. My parents sat stiffly, my father in a navy suit, my mother with her hands folded tightly in her lap. I see familiar faces in this room, I said. Faces that once looked away, that stayed silent when I screamed, that told themselves I was dramatic, unstable, wrong. My throat tightened, but I pressed on. I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to erase you. I'm here because I survived you. That night, I didn't need revenge. I needed release. And as I ended my speech with the words, I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to become. I felt it. Closure. Not perfect. Not pretty. But real. After the event, I greeted a line of readers. Hugs. Thank yous. Photos. But my parents didn't approach me. They sat in their chairs long after the crowd cleared. And then quietly, they left. No words. Just the truth between us. A week passed. And then another. Until one day, I received a package. Inside, a box of old photographs, me as a child, smiling, unaware of the pain that would one day come. Tucked inside the last photo was a note. We see now what we failed to. We're sorry we didn't stay when you needed us. We're sorry we tried to erase what made you strong. No name signed, but I didn't need one. Forgiveness is a strange thing. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't even mean reconciling. It means releasing yourself from the grip of their power. And that's what I did. Not for them, but for me. Soon after, My second book was published. The Voice in the Silence. A guide for survivors of emotional abandonment. It wasn't just stories, it was a blueprint for healing. It climbed bestseller lists, not because I marketed it well, but because it was needed. And one afternoon, as I sat on a panel beside renowned authors, the moderator asked me, "What would you say to the version of you who was kicked out alone on the side of that road?" I smiled softly. I'd say she was never lost. She was just on her way back to herself. 1 month later, I received a phone call from Mr. Carlton. His voice was shaky, but warm. "I've been diagnosed with something final." My heart sank. He had become more than a mentor. He was the first person who saw me. "I'm not afraid," he said. "But before I go, I need you to know you saved me too." I cried after that call. Not because of the goodbye, but because for the first time in my life, I knew I had mattered. At his funeral, I was asked to speak. And I did. With clarity, with gratitude, and with love. Because some people don't come into your life to stay. They come to awaken you. I later founded a nonprofit in his name, the Carlton James Foundation for Lost Voices. We published first-time authors, held writing retreats, created safe spaces for survivors. And every year, on the anniversary of my first speech, I stood before a new crowd, sharing the same message. You are not broken. You are becoming. And yet, life wasn't perfect. I had hard days, nights I doubted, moments I wanted to hide again. But destiny has a way of reminding you, you're here for a reason. And as long as your story breathes, someone else finds the courage to tell theirs. So here we are. You, sitting wherever you are in the world, maybe in a quiet corner with your headphones on, maybe hiding away in your car during a break, or maybe curled under a blanket late at night, heart beating like mine once did. And me, Alyssa Moore, just a woman who was never supposed to matter. Yet here I am. Still standing. Still speaking. Still writing. They wanted me gone, remember? But destiny had other plans. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel like your story didn't matter? Like your voice was too loud, or not loud enough? Like your truth was an inconvenience? If you have, I want you to know something now that I didn't know back then. You are not the problem. You never were. We grow up believing that survival means shrinking, that keeping the peace means staying silent, that being the good daughter, partner, employee, friend means swallowing the truth whole. But here's what I've learned. Swallowing your truth doesn't save you. It slowly undoes you, until one day, you look in the mirror and no longer recognize the reflection staring back. I nearly disappeared inside the silence they wrapped around me. But I clawed my way back, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with truth. Word by word, page by page, tear by tear. I don't know who tried to silence you. A parent who never believed in you? A sibling who twisted your dreams into weapons? A partner who made you feel small? A community that labeled you too different? Whoever it was, whatever happened, I'm telling you this with every piece of my healed heart. You still have time to take your story back. You still have time to reclaim your name, your light, your place in this world. People will try to rewrite your narrative. They'll minimize your pain, mock your progress, question your clarity. Let them. Because one day, they'll see what you've always known. That you were never lost. Just misunderstood. Just unheard. Just unseen. Until now. I spent years chasing love from people who didn't know how to give it. I made myself small to fit into boxes never meant for me. But not anymore. And neither should you. If you're reading this and you feel stuck, if you feel like your voice has been buried under shame, fear, rejection, then this is your moment. Not just to cry, not just to nod, but to rise. Tell your story, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, even if no one claps. Tell it anyway, because every time you speak your truth, you loosen the grip of those who tried to control it. Every time you stand tall, you remind someone else they can, too. Every time you choose healing over hiding, you shift something in the world. You don't need permission. Not anymore. You don't need their validation. their applause, or their acceptance. You just need you. And trust me, you are enough. I've walked through storms I thought would drown me. I've heard my name twisted into rumors. I've been laughed at, lied about, left behind. But here's the twist they never saw coming. The girl they tried to erase became the woman the world couldn't ignore.
And you?
You're next. Not next to suffer, but next to rise. Next to write.
Next to speak.
Next to heal. I'll leave you with this. Life won't always be fair. People won't always be kind.
But you?
You always have a choice. To show up anyway. To stay soft when the world tells you to harden. To remain open when others shut down. To turn your wounds into wisdom. And your silence into strength. So I ask you one final time. What would happen if you stopped hiding? What would happen if you stopped waiting for the world to make space for you? And instead, built your own table? Wouldn't that be something? Because maybe destiny isn't some faraway plan written in stars. Maybe it's you, deciding that you won't let them write the ending anymore. Maybe it's you, taking the pen back, and writing the most powerful sentence of all. I was never gone. I was just getting ready.